G'day. Today we're talking again Ram 3500s and the ownership experience of owning a Ram 3500, in this case a used Ram 3500 in Australia. So my previous videos I've done I initially was very excited about the Ram 1500 and I detailed my reasons for not buying a Ram 1500 and then the reasons I ended up buying this truck. And for anybody who owns a North American vehicle in Australia, pretty much you get bombarded regularly with questions of what it's like to own a US truck in Australia. So I thought I'd do a couple of videos on that. The first one is what the ownership experience is like. What's it like, to own a Ram 3500 in this case. But this equally applies to a Ram 2500, not so much to the 1500. They're a lighter truck, both in total weight, in GVM, in GCM. A lot of things don't apply to that, but some of them do. And then I also want to do a video on what it's like to maintain it. This is a used truck. All the machinery on the farm I maintain myself. Doesn't matter if it's the tractor or the mulcher, the ATVs, farm vehicles. I try and maintain them myself. And one of my concerns going into owning a US truck was, how am I going to go maintaining it myself? Am I going to be able to get access to expertise I need to assist in maintaining the vehicle, and am I going to be able to get parts? So that'll be subject to a second video. This is more to address some of the common questions I get around owning a US truck, and this would be common to pretty much anybody who owns a US truck, whether it be a GMC or a Toyota Tundra or a Nissan Titan or an F250, F350 or the Ram series of vehicles. So this particular vehicle is the previous generation in Ram trucks. It is the 5.9 Cummins. It's 2005 and I purchased it with circa 200,000 Ks on the clock. And pretty much from getting it and driving it home, ever since I got it home, people have been wanting to know the same questions: is what's it like on the road, and what's it like to park, what's it like on fuel, and what's it like to tow with. And the last one principally, if you're going to buy a US truck, you might like the look of them, you might like the room in them, you might like the flexibility of the load carrying capacity in a 2500 or 3500, not so much in the 1500 because their payload's so low. It's pretty much comparable with a domestic ute or below, like a 1 ton configuration domestic ute. But with the 25 and 3500s, certainly their payloads and GCMs are a lot higher. And indeed their GVM as well. So you might like the additional payload that they offer there, but what is it that is the real experience of owning one of these trucks and driving it on the road in Australia across principally those metrics. So when I bought this, I got it inspected, as I said in the previous video, by Red Book Inspect. Flew over after that, gave it pretty much the all clear. Took it for a drive myself, went over it, checked it out, yep, content to buy it, bought it, and then drove it home. I bought it in an Australian capital city, drove it home. It was a long way home, so got a fairly good, snapshot of what the truck was like, and those initial impressions have pretty much been confirmed over time in terms of what the ownership experience has been like. So I bought it. It was bought, as I said, in the capital city, and I made my way through basically parts of suburbia hell to get out of the city and then onto the highway and then the freeway to come home. Driving through suburbia, it's an unwieldy thing. It's wide, it's long. You want to, especially if you're going down a narrow suburban street, you want to know where you're going. You want to look far down the road. If you've got a car coming the other way and there's cars parked on the side of the road and there's only a 1 car space to get through, that's pretty typical of any other vehicle. I have found with this, most people will wait, pull up and wait for you to get through. But if you're sensible and courteous and you wait for people to come through and they wait for you, you'll be able to meander through that. But it is a big vehicle. In terms of width, and this comes again to later on to what's it like to park, the width of it is not greatly different to, say, a 200 or a 100 series Land Cruiser. It's about 2.5% wider than a 200 series Land Cruiser. When you sit on the interior of this car, you would think that it's a lot wider than that. But the reason is, if you look down the side of the vehicle on this 3500, it's pretty much a big cube. The size of the vehicle goes straight up and down, and that gives you a lot of interior space. With a Land Cruiser, the cabin slopes in. It's an equivalent example would be something like if you jump in a new PX Ranger, the cabin very much tilts in. Whereas with an Amarok, it's very box shaped. The sides of the vehicle is straight up and down, and it gives you a lot more interior space, which is a good thing if you're pursuing bulk interior space as opposed to improving aerodynamics or whatever. But this is basically a big cube. So it is wide, and you sit so high, you really know, that your car's on the road and you're looking down on pretty much everything outside of a B double coming the other way at you or behind you or whatever. They're a big truck, and the turning on them. I knew that this has got the long box option. So this is 3500 with a long box. So it's very, very long. And I knew going in that it wasn't going to be great on turning. My previous experience was in the Brazilian, 2000, circa 2005, right-hand drive factory built F250s that were sold in Australia. They had a leaf sprung front end and they turned abominably bad. They really do turn poorly. And I went into this going, that's probably what I'm going to be back in for again. And I've just got to take that as par for the course. And I was pleasantly surprised that it was a little better than I expected. But it is a long vehicle. It would be, that turning circle issue would be alleviated to a little degree with a short box ute, and the modern utes, admittedly, like the 2020 versions, are indeed better. They turn a lot better than these older trucks. But this model, this generation truck with a short box would turn better than this one. But it's better than I expected. But if you come off, say, like a Triton, MQ Triton, which turn pretty much as good as any dual cab ute, and then you jump into one of these things, you'll just be going, oh my God, this thing will not turn. It's like turning the bloody QE2. But I knew that was going to be a concession I had to make going in, and I haven't found it too bad. But if you're going to make some tight turns, you do want to think about it. And that comes again into parking, which we'll talk about later on. So picked it up, made our way through suburbia, hit the highway. One of my enduring memories of that trip was just how comfortable I found the seat to be. And to this day, I find that the seats in this thing, especially that driver's seat, is probably one of, if not the most comfortable driver's seat I've ever sat in. And I've driven the new 1500, and this is a middle spec Ram 3500, and you drive the Express, which would be probably a little bit of a grade below this one, modern, but it's reasonably equivalent. I didn't find those seats to be that comfortable, not as comfortable as this anyway. These seats are really, really comfortable. The Laramie for sure is better. Haven't driven a 2020 Ram in the DT, which is the current model. Haven't driven one of those. Expect them to be very good also. But the seats are magnificent. They're big, wide. The Land Cruiser I have, a friend of mine described it as like driving a couch compared to his dual cab ute. And this is similar. The seats are very couch-like, very, very comfortable. But the ride is a lot firmer because this has got optioned on it the heavy-duty Mopar suspension, so it's a lot more rigid, and you've got to deal with a ute with a very high GCM, and that's dialed into the rear suspension tuning, which makes it very stiff at the back end. On a good surface, on the highway, it's great, so you really appreciate the good seating. On a rough surface, you would really like to have some load in the back to try and settle that rear end down. It does get very jittery very, very quickly, but that's purely a result of how heavy duty that rear suspension is in the 3500. And when you option on top of that the Mopar heavy duty suspension, that makes that more pronounced. So it's not nearly as couch-like as what the Land Cruiser is, but I wouldn't expect it to be. This is a utility vehicle. It's not a wagon. It has a leaf rear end. It doesn't have a coil rear end, and it's built to tow heavy loads. But on the highway, I was very impressed with the comfort of it. Very impressed with the seating. The driving position is excellent. You've got fantastic visibility, absolutely fantastic visibility. You're so high you can see everything. The Ram sits on the road on a freeway in freeway lanes, no problems. You've got to remember those roads are built to have B doubles running up and down them. So the Ram on that sort of road is really not a big deal at all. On the freeway, it's effortless to drive. It's got oodles and oodles of power. If you come off, say, again, a current generation 4-cylinder turbo diesel ute in Australia and jump into one of these, this takes longer, and you can floor it and you get immediate power and torque, and you just lose traction and spin the wheels. I tend to take off gently, whereas I might tend to take off more aggressively in a 4-cylinder ute because I can more reliably get the power to the ground. This thing will tend to lose traction if you nail it off the mark. I do tend to be a little bit gentler off the mark with this thing, but it's got masses and masses of power, masses of torque. If you drive somewhere like between Melbourne and Sydney, and you're heading up past Tarcutta on the way to Gundagai, you've got some steep hills, some long pools. Even if you travel unladen up those steep hills on the freeway, 110, pretty much in any vehicle that I've owned. It could be my MN Triton, my PJ Ranger, my Hilux. You're shifting down through the gears, and it's pretty unlikely you're going to maintain 110 all the way up the hill, unless you're gunning it to well above the speed limit. As you enter the hill, you're going to drop below 110 before you reach the top. This thing will maintain 110 all the way to the peak without a worry in the world. It'll work to, the engine will work harder as you get closer to the top of the hill as you're cresting, for sure. And if you were pulling a load, a very, very heavy load, if you had 4 tons on the ball, you'd probably back it off on such a long, pronounced gradient. But it has immense amounts of power, which you would expect with a 5.9 litre inline 6 turbo diesel. You would expect that, and the current generation are no different. Huge amounts of power, which is one of the reasons that you buy it. So on the highway, it's very good. As I said, on rough roads, it's a little, you do pay a price for that heavy duty suspension, especially if you've got nothing in it. But on the freeway, it is indeed a very pleasant place to be, and that's been echoed by my kids. When the kids come with me, jump in, have all the family on board. The previous dual cab we had to this, I think, was the MN Triton. It was the last dual cab proper that we had before this. And I found that on pretty much any trip of any sort of reasonable duration, the kids would get sick of sitting on top of each other. Like, there is a slight angle to the MN Triton back seat, which gives you, a little bit more of a lean, a little bit more comfortable seating position, but that cabin is very narrow. It's not really any different from utes of that generation, like the Hilux or the PK Ranger, BT50, Colorado and such. They're narrow cabins, and the kids are just that little bit close together, and I find that the kids want to, get into each other by the end of the trip. And that especially presented itself when I bought my Land Cruiser. Land Cruiser a lot wider. All of a sudden, the kids had a lot of room to spread out, and they really didn't argue. There was really no fights, and I was quite surprised that at the end of the trip we got home and no disagreements, but they'd had room to stretch out, and they weren't sitting on top of each other, no punch-ons. And this is very similar. It's just as wide, lots of room, good feet room in the back. You got good leg room. You can, put your stuff under your feet for the kids if they want to, and they're not, all crammed in. We generally put the car seat in the middle. There's 3 restrain points for car seats across the back seat, which is good, and they're in a really good position, really easy to latch in a car seat. Typically, we'll have the car seat on the outside of the car, and a long trip we'll move it into the centre, keep the older kids apart. Generally, not always, generally that's what we'll do. And we've found that works really well, and they appreciate the larger cabin. They appreciate the view. I've got one child who regularly gets car sick, and doesn't nearly get car sick as much in the Land Cruiser or in this, now that they've got more room, which is really welcome if you've got a child that frequently gets car sick, to be away from that issue. And of course in this ute you've also got the jump seat in the front. You can fold up the jump seat and you can chuck a kid in the front as well, and that gives you some more seating options as well. If you've got disagreeing kids in the back seat, you can move one to the front seat. If you want to put something big on the back seat, you can lift up one of the seats. You've got the platform underneath, you can stow that in the back seat, and then you can move a child to the front seat if you want to. The one thing I haven't done is I haven't travelled overnight with a child in the jump seat. I've done a long trip with a child in the jump seat and it wasn't a problem. The jump seat is pretty wide and accommodates the child in the jump seat with someone in the passenger seat in the front and the driver's seat, and they're not touching them. The driver's and passenger seat are very wide, easy to sit on without interfering with the child in the jump seat. That trip was fine. The back seat would be the child's preference in most cases, although being up, again, if you're a child who suffers car sickness, being up the front and being look out the front window is no bad thing. You've got to take that into account with safety ratings and all that sort of thing. Having a child in the front seat, that's up to you. But having the additional option of being able to either move people around or to have 4 kids in a dual cab is a real benefit. I find that a real benefit of owning this car. One downside of the jump seat is that I haven't travelled overnight. The jump seat doesn't have a rear headrest. So what you can do if you're a child, and I've seen my child do that, is scoot your bum forward on the seat and lean back onto the jump seat to give yourself a little bit more options for sitting there, but doesn't have a headrest. So to fall asleep on the jump seat, if you were travelling late at night or overnight, that would probably be a challenge. In the back seat, there's headrests on either side. There's not in the middle, so that's generally why we'll put car seat in the middle, so the kids either side of the car seat have got a headrest, which is a big plus from the 2005 model ute compared to the 2005 F250s, which has just got that slab back seat. The seating in this is infinitely better, I got to say, infinitely better than the equivalent 2005 model F250s, the Brazilian builds that were sold in Australia. The seating in this is way better, just objectively better than those vehicles, if for no other reason, and there's lots of reasons, but if no other reason, from the back seat actually gets some headrests, which is very welcome if you've got kids in the back seat, especially as they get older and they need those headrests. Driving on the freeway, it's quite a comfortable place to be. Compromises on dirt roads. Now, parking it, I live in a regional centre. It's a regional centre in the Shire. We've got circa, so let's say 10,000 people. So it's not a massive regional centre, but it's it's a reasonable regional town. I find driving this around, going into town from the farm and driving around in town, no problems at all. You've got on the main street, you've got 6 metre parking for vehicles. So this will park in there, no problems at all. And, you've really got plenty of options in terms of parking your vehicles, as long as I haven't taken them to the supermarket car park, but, generally I'll just park it on the street. 6 metre parking, this will park there, no problems at all. I said no, not really any wider than a Toyota Land Cruiser. So in my town, it's not really a compromise at all. Even in, suburban courts and stuff in the town, it's really not a problem to drive this down the street. It's quite simple. I have driven it into the city. I've taken it into multiple capital cities, and that was one of the things I was a bit concerned about owning it. I thought, what if I have to go to the airport? What if I have to go to a shopping centre? Probably mean I have to leave the Ram at home. I parked at a metropolitan hospital, airport, shopping centre, no problem. Haven't done multi-storey or underground car parks. I've always opted to go outside. And I found as long as you think about it before you leave home, it's really not a big deal. So I parked this at the airport, parked in the outside car park, parked up against the curb and backed it in and overhung the back of the tray over the curb and the gravel in the curbing. Overhang the tray, backed all the way until the tyres touched the curb. Parked there, the nose didn't stick out of the car park. It fit within the lines. I parked well away from everybody, came back after a week of working abroad, and it was undamaged, not a problem at all. So I've done that a couple of times. Also taken it into shopping centre car parks again. I chose to park outside, back it in, overhang the curb, fit in the car parking space in between the lines, and I've done exactly the same thing at a metropolitan hospital as well. The hospital was car park was absolutely chock-a-block full, waited for someone to leave, backed in, it took me a couple of goes to back in, forward, get the angle right, then go all the way in, overhang the curb, park the car, locked her up, walked away, no problems at all. And haven't had any issues. I have had someone back into it. This was locally. Now that's just a jerk move. They backed into the tub of it and promptly drove off. So that's a bit of a bummer. But that could happen to any vehicle. That I wasn't outside the lines or anything. I wasn't parked in a precarious situation. They just backed into it for whatever reason and then decided to take off. So that's unfortunate, but it wasn't a symptom of the truck itself. So parking's been better than I thought. The last time I went to Melbourne, I went to a conference, and the conference venue had a narrow snaking driveway up to the car park. And I went, oh, this might be a bit difficult. Drove all the way up the car park and then had to reverse parallel park it, and was able to do that for the duration of the event. No problems. It was, I thought it'd be a little bit more challenging than what it was. But if you take your time, you can get it in the car park, and it was okay. So most car parks, not all, there's some multi-story car parks that have very, very narrow car parks, but most car parks have to be built to accommodate a 200 series Land Cruiser width. That's a common car on the road. So if it can accommodate that, it can accommodate one of these. The only difference would be in a multi-story car park or an underground car park. Obviously you can't overhang the curb, so this thing wouldn't fit in a underground or multi-story car park where I'd back up against the wall. The snout would be significantly protruding out into traffic, so I wouldn't like to do that. And I'm not one to park in a car park, just drive over the line and just take up two car parks, just park it smack bang in the middle of a car parking space over the middle of the line and take up two spaces. If you choose to do that, that's up to you. I don't think that's a courteous move, so I don't do that. I always park within the lines, and if I can't do that, I'd move on. And I haven't found a problem, but I must admit, when I have gone into the city, I have Googled before I left where car parks are near the places I'm going. So if I am taking this, I can go, yep, I'm comfortable that I'm going to be able to park it if I take it. But so far, so good. Haven't had any issues with that. But I can see that if you were in suburbia, in a metro area, if you're in South Yarra in Melbourne, probably not the vehicle for you unless you had a specific purpose for it, that you were towing a boat away or a race car or something on the weekends, and that's specifically the reason that you owned it. But if you jumped from a wagon in a metro and jump to something like this, you're going to find it difficult as a daily driver for sure. Fuel economy has been surprising. So I've found this thing to get me, over time, we're talking about nearly 12 months now, 13.5 to 14.5 is what I'd say I'm comfortable in getting, reasonably expectation. I have got it down to basically nearly 13 flat, and I wouldn't, that's on a level drive, no aircon on, no towing, but I have got it down that low. But 13.5, 14.5, somewhere in that range, I'm comfortable with expecting. And I do the maths because the trip computer, as with pretty much every trip computer, is inaccurate. It doesn't give you the correct readout. It will, if you jumped in there and had a look at it right now, it'll say somewhere around 13 flat. And yeah, I have done that, as I've said, but that's not reliably what it gets. Not even close. Well, 13.5 to 14.5 is what it gets. And every time I refill the tank, I work it out mathematically to figure out exactly what my fuel economy is. And that's real world combined sort of travel in and out of town as well as freeway driving. That's what I would expect to get. I haven't loaded it up to tow 4.5 tons yet. I have towed with it, and the towing that I have done was not, really working it hard, and I got about 15. So it wasn't a massive jump up to do towing in it. Once I do a heavy tow, I might update or do a subsequent video and let you know what it does when it's really working hard. But at the moment, I've seen it at about 15 towing, but that's not towing at capacity admittedly. So I've found the fuel consumption pretty good. So my Hilux, I've got a circa 2013 Hilux, and it gets 11. Just 11 on the freeway, combined travel, 11 litres per 100 kilometres. That's just what it seems to do. No better, no worse. That's really about what it gets. So with this thing, I'm getting approximately, 25%, using about 25% more fuel than my Hilux. And I'm quite content with that. It's significantly heavier. It's about 50%. A little bit less than 50%, but getting close to 50% heavier. It'll pull 4.5 tons as opposed to 2.5 ton. It'll have 6 seats as opposed to 2. It's got a 6-cylinder 5.9 as opposed to a 4-cylinder 3. It's a lot bigger car, lot bigger capacity, a lot more weight. And to only pay 25% more fuel, I was factoring 15 litres. That's what I'd hoped I would be able to get, and I'm getting, 10% better than that, so I'm really happy. And considering what I'm getting in other vehicles, my 100 series Land Cruiser gets between 10 and 11, so that's a little better. But again, doesn't have the towing capacity, doesn't have the load capacity that this vehicle does. So over saying that I'm going to use, say, about 3 litres per 100 kilometres, if you do 20,000 Ks a year in your vehicle, so 20,000 Ks a year, doing, as opposed to my Hilux, which is about 11, say 3 litres worse off doing that at $1.50 a litre. You're probably about $1,000 a year, $900,000 a year, that this thing's costing you extra to run around in. And given the flexibility that it gives you, the Hilux that we have is farm use. All the employees use it. It's used extensively, especially at harvest. I need a car to get around with. And this was the replacement for my truck. I sold my old truck. I was sick of logbooks, sick of weigh stations. Sold my old Beavertail truck. This has replaced that. So I've come from driving a ute and having a truck to do heavy loads and moving stuff around. And I've combined those two things into one thing. And pretty much if you average the fuel economy from my old Beavertail and my old ute into this truck, it's basically halfway in between. There's some capital savings there in terms of total outlay cost. There's certainly insurance savings. So I think that the fuel economy, $1,000 extra a year as opposed to my Hilux, for example, with the flexibility that this gives me, is money well spent, considering I don't have to pay registration annually. If I had to own the other truck and a ute annually, the fuel that I spend on this is offset by the registration I would have had to pay for 2 vehicles previously. So I've come from 2 into 1, and that's how I justify this. So, but in any event, I found the fuel economy quite acceptable. There's some people with the later model Rams that will say they get a lot better fuel economy than that, and they may. But as I said, I've seen 12 on the trip computer meter here. On this thing, I've seen 11 at times, and when I actually work it out, I'm getting 13.5 to 14.5. I don't trust trip computers. If anybody tells you what their car is actually getting them in fuel, I would suggest to make sure that they've actually worked it out, because if they're going off the trip computer, even with modern vehicles, like brand new vehicles, the trip computers are so frequently wrong, they're not really an accurate portrayal of what fuel economy is actually being used by the truck. But anyway, moving on. So that's fuel economy. Driving's been fine. In terms of cost to run it, registration's a little bit higher, but not much. But admittedly, I'm a primary producer. This is a vehicle that is used for primary production, so I do get a little bit of a discount there. Off personal registrations, it's not a massive amount, but it's a little bit. Insurance is not greatly more expensive than any of the other vehicles that I own. Might be 15% higher. It's not going to break the bank, considering the flexibility it offers me. And you've got to watch tyres. Your tyres, you've got to make sure they're load rated sufficiently, but they are a common size on this vehicle. So I do have some options there, so that's really good. In terms of other consumables, I will leave that for the topic for another day. That can be another video that I will post on what this thing's been like to maintain, what's it been like to service, what's it been like to tow. I haven't put 4.5 tons on the ball yet. When I do that, I'll be content to update you on what it's like for heavy towing. But the towing that I've done now, the adage that it doesn't even know that it's there springs to mind. You know, it's got masses of power, and I would suspect that anything, you know, once you go past 3.5 tons, once you go past 3 tons even, the vehicle's going to feel it more. But it's more than capable of doing it. Like, this has been down rated so that it can be driven on a car license, which is to be noted. If you buy a 3500, it does give you a higher payload and a higher GCM, and that's going to give you more towing options. I've chosen to forego some of that and down rate it to 4.5 tons so that my wife and I can both drive it. I've got a truck license, she doesn't. By down rate, I'm not going to be a huge tourer and camper. I don't need a GCM beyond 9 tons. 9 tons is heaps for me. This has a dry weight of about 3, so I've got 1.5 tons up my sleeve plus 4.5 tons on the ball. So, you know, for roundabout numbers. So that's more than enough for me, although some people who do touring and load their vehicles right up with options and such are knocking on the ceiling and they want more GVM or they want more GCM, which is one of the advantages the 3500 gives you. But being able to downrate it is a good thing for me. It gives me the long box, gives me options when I sell it. I can either sell it to someone who wants a vehicle with 4.5 tons, they can drive it on a car license, or if they want to upgrade it back to what it was originally registered at, they can do that as well. So far, I found it quite good. As I said, if I was living in the city, would I own it in a city? I'd have to have a really specific reason for owning it, and that would probably be towing. But if I didn't have that reason, I probably wouldn't own it. You'd really need a good reason to own it. But out in the country where I need a tray, I need a long tray to be able to move, and want to be able to move all the kids around with me, this has worked extremely well. I'm very pleased with it. But I will leave all the questions on servicing for another day. But first impressions have been good. If you're looking at a Ram truck, the principal thing that you'd want to consider is what need are you trying to fulfill? If you do have a genuine need, take one for a drive and see what it's like. I've found them good, and if you do have a need for it, I hope you do too. Appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time.